Rain pounded the streets of Philadelphia, transforming the city into a glistening maze of reflections. Amber Collins hurried along Chestnut Street, her umbrella fighting against the wind as she made her way back to her apartment after a long shift at the hospital. At 32, she had recently completed her residency and now worked as an emergency room doctor, a job that regularly exposed her to the full spectrum of human experience. As she passed an alleyway between two brick buildings, she noticed a hunched figure seeking shelter beneath a small awning. The man wore layers of weathered clothing, his gray beard long and unkempt. What caught Amber's attention wasn't his presence. Homeless individuals were unfortunately common in the city, but rather his feet. Despite the cold November rain, he wore only tattered sneakers with holes that exposed his bare skin to the elements. Amber hesitated. She had passed countless homeless people during her years in Philadelphia, sometimes offering spare change, other times hurrying by with the guilt that accompanied urban living. But something about this man's dignity amid desperation made her stop. "Excuse me, sir?" she called, stepping closer while maintaining a respectful distance. "Would you like some coffee? There's a shop just down the block." The man looked up, his eyes a startling clear blue that contrasted with his weathered face. "That's very kind of you, miss," he replied, his voice carrying an unexpected eloquence. "Coffee would be wonderful." "I'll be right back," Amber promised, hurrying to the nearby cafe where she ordered 2 large coffees and a sandwich. When she returned, the man had straightened his posture slightly, as if preparing to receive a guest. Amber handed him the coffee and food, then, making a quick decision, placed her shopping bag beside him. "There are some new socks in here," she explained, "and a scarf. I just bought them, but I think you need them more than I do." The man's weathered hands trembled slightly as he accepted the items. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed deeper gratitude. "I'm Amber," she offered. "Thomas," he replied. "Thomas Reeves." Something about the way he stated his name, with quiet authority despite his circumstances, struck Amber as unusual, but she didn't dwell on it. "It's nice to meet you, Thomas. I have to get going, but please stay warm." As she walked away, Amber felt the familiar mix of emotions: satisfaction at having helped someone, sadness at the reality of homelessness, and the nagging feeling that such small gestures were inadequate against the enormity of the problem. That night in her modest one-bedroom apartment, as rain continued to drum against her windows, Amber thought about Thomas. She had encountered hundreds of patients in crisis, many homeless, but something about this man had pierced the professional barrier she had carefully constructed over years of medical training. Perhaps it was the articulate way he spoke, or the dignified nod he had given her as she left. The next morning, Amber woke to her alarm at 5:30 a.m. for her early shift. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a crisp clarity to the air. As she walked to work, she found herself scanning the alleyway where she had met Thomas, but he was gone. 3 days passed before Amber saw Thomas again. This time, he was sitting on a bench in Rittenhouse Square, feeding pigeons with crumbs from a paper bag. She might not have recognized him except for the scarf she had given him, dark blue with subtle gray stripes, wrapped around his neck. "Thomas?" she approached cautiously. He looked up, recognition warming his features. "Dr. Collins." "Good morning." Amber blinked in surprise. "How did you know I'm a doctor?" A slight smile crossed his face. "The hospital ID card was visible on your coat when we met. And your manner. Clinical assessment mixed with compassion. It's distinctive." Amber sat down beside him, intrigued by his observational skills. "Are the socks working out?" "Very much so," he nodded. "First new pair I've had in months." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the pigeons compete for crumbs. "Would you like to join me for breakfast?" Amber asked suddenly, surprising herself with the invitation. "There's a diner around the corner that makes great pancakes." Thomas appeared to consider the offer carefully before nodding. "I would appreciate that." At the diner, seated in a booth by the window, Amber noticed how Thomas seemed simultaneously out of place, and yet completely at ease. He navigated the menu with the care of someone unaccustomed to such choices, but when the waitress approached, he ordered with clarity and courtesy. "So, Thomas," Amber began after they had ordered, "have you been in Philadelphia long?" "All my life," he replied, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug. Born at Pennsylvania Hospital in 1952. Except for law school in Virginia, I've never lived anywhere else. Law school? Amber couldn't hide her surprise. Thomas took a slow sip of coffee before responding. I was an attorney for 27 years, and then a judge for 15. The casual way he delivered this information made Amber wonder if she had misheard. A judge? As in, a court judge? He nodded, a hint of weariness crossing his features. Court of Common Pleas. I retired 6 years ago. Before Amber could process this revelation, their food arrived. Thomas waited for her to begin eating before carefully cutting into his pancakes with deliberate precision. I don't understand, Amber said finally. How does a retired judge end up homeless? Thomas finished her sentence. It's a reasonable question. The answer isn't simple or comfortable, but it follows a pattern you've probably seen in your medical practice. Mental health, financial mistakes, and isolation can unravel a life surprisingly quickly. He spoke without self-pity, describing how after his wife died of cancer 8 years ago, he had fallen into depression. After retirement, he had made a series of poor investments, encouraged by a financial advisor who turned out to be running a sophisticated scam targeting seniors. By the time the fraud was discovered, Thomas had lost nearly everything. My daughter lives in Seattle with her family, he continued. She offered to have me move in with them, but I declined. Pride, perhaps, or not wanting to be a burden. Either way, I tried to manage on my own. When I could no longer afford my apartment, I stayed with friends, then in shelters. Eventually, here we are. Amber listened, medical training allowing her to identify the clinical signs of depression and possible cognitive decline beneath Thomas's articulate narrative. But she also heard something else, a man telling his story with dignity and tact, refusing to be defined solely by his circumstances. Have you sought help from legal aid organizations? She asked. Surely as a former judge. I've explored some options, Thomas interrupted gently, but systems designed to help often require persistent navigation, which becomes challenging when you're focused on finding your next meal or safe place to sleep. He paused. To be honest, Dr. Collins, after a while, invisibility becomes comfortable. It's easier not to explain who you once were. As they finished breakfast, Amber experienced the familiar frustration that often accompanied her work. The recognition of how systems meant to support people frequently failed those who needed them most. She had seen countless patients cycle through the ER, their medical issues intertwined with housing instability, lack of consistent care, and bureaucratic obstacles. Thomas, she said finally, would you be willing to meet with someone I know? She works for a veterans assistance program. I'm not a veteran, he replied. I know, but she also volunteers with a program that helps seniors navigate social services. She's remarkably effective at cutting through red tape. Thomas studied her face for a long moment before nodding. I appreciate the suggestion, Dr. Collins. Amber, she corrected him. Please call me Amber. As they prepared to leave the diner, Amber felt a growing determination. This encounter had moved beyond a simple act of kindness to a homeless man. Thomas Reeves represented something that disturbed and motivated her, the thin line between stability and crisis that could affect anyone, regardless of their past achievements or contributions. Can we meet here again, same time next week? She asked. I'll bring my friend who can help. Thomas adjusted the blue scarf around his neck, the only visible sign of their first meeting. I'll be here, he promised. The following week, Amber arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, accompanied by Marlene Jenkins, a social worker with 30 years of experience navigating Philadelphia's complex social service landscape. Amber had met Marlene during her residency, when the older woman had helped countless patients find resources after discharge. So this judge, he's been on the streets how long? Marlene asked, her practical mind already formulating approaches. About 2 years from what he told me, Amber replied. But I think the decline started much earlier, after his wife died. Marlene nodded knowingly. Loss is often the trigger, then isolation, then poor decisions that wouldn't have happened with a support system in place. She pulled out a small notebook. You said his name is Thomas Reeves? Court of Common Pleas? Yes. Does that mean something to you? Marlene's expression grew serious. If he's who I think he is, Judge Reeves was known for his work with juvenile offenders, created a diversion program that became a model across the state, kept a lot of kids out of the system. Before Amber could respond, she spotted Thomas entering the diner. He was wearing the same clothes as before, but she noticed they appeared cleaner. His beard had been trimmed, and he carried himself with subtle dignity as he approached their table. "Good morning, Amber," he said, then turned to Marlene. "You must be the friend I've heard about." Marlene stood and extended her hand. "Marlene Jenkins. I believe we may have crossed paths years ago, Judge Reeves. I sometimes testified in dependency cases." A flash of recognition crossed Thomas's face. "Ms. Jenkins? Of course. You were always exceptionally prepared." They settled into the booth, ordered coffee, and began what would become a 3-hour conversation. With gentle but persistent questioning, Marlene drew out details of Thomas's situation that he had glossed over with Amber. The financial fraud that had decimated his savings had targeted several retired judges and lawyers, exploiting their trust in a former colleague who had established what appeared to be a legitimate investment firm. When the scheme collapsed, Thomas had not only lost his investments, but also discovered that his identity had been used to secure loans he knew nothing about. "The legal proceedings dragged on for years," Thomas explained. "By the time there was any resolution, I had already lost my condo and most of my possessions. The depression made it difficult to fight effectively." "Where have you been staying recently?" Marlene asked. "There's a shelter on North Broad that allows 2-week stays," Thomas replied. "When that period ends, I rotate to others, sometimes spending nights in the train station when beds aren't available." Amber listened, increasingly troubled by how a man who had once presided over a courtroom now struggled to find a safe place to sleep. "What happened with your pension?" Marlene asked, cutting to a practical concern. Thomas's expression tightened slightly. "The fraud included remortgaging my home and taking loans against my pension. When everything collapsed, the pension payments were reduced to cover the debts. What remains is insufficient for housing in Philadelphia." Marlene made notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Finally, she looked up at Thomas with determination. "Judge Reeves, I believe we can address this situation, but I need your permission to make some calls and access certain records." Thomas hesitated, and Amber recognized the struggle playing across his features, the battle between necessity and the pride of a man who had once held authority. "I've been managing," he said finally. "No, sir. With all due respect, you've been surviving," Marlene corrected him. "There's a difference, and you deserve more than survival." Something in Marlene's firm tone seemed to reach Thomas. He nodded slowly. "Very well, Ms. Jenkins. You have my permission." The conversation shifted to immediate practicalities, getting Thomas into stable temporary housing while longer-term solutions were arranged, addressing medical needs that had been neglected, and beginning the process of untangling the legal and financial complications. When they finally prepared to leave, Marlene handed Thomas a business card. "I'll pick you up at the shelter tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have several appointments to keep." After Thomas had departed, Marlene turned to Amber with a serious expression. "That man changed the trajectory of countless lives through his work on the bench," she said. "I'm going to call in every favor I'm owed to help him." Amber nodded. "What can I do?" "He needs medical attention," Marlene replied. "I saw how he was favoring his right leg, and that cough concerns me. Can you arrange an examination?" "I'll set it up at the community clinic where I volunteer," Amber promised. Over the next 2 weeks, Amber witnessed Marlene's formidable networking skills in action. Through a combination of legal aid connections, social service agencies, and personal relationships built over decades, she managed to secure Thomas a place in a transitional housing program specifically designed for seniors. Amber, meanwhile, arranged for Thomas to receive a comprehensive medical evaluation, which revealed untreated hypertension, early-stage cataracts, and a respiratory infection that explained his persistent cough. With her help, he began receiving appropriate medications and treatment. During this period, Amber learned more about Thomas's career from public records and conversations with Marlene. Judge Reeves had indeed been a pioneering force in juvenile justice reform, creating programs that diverted first-time offenders into community service and educational opportunities rather than detention. His approaches, revolutionary when implemented in the 1990s, had since been adopted throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. One evening, while helping Thomas organize his few possessions in his new temporary apartment, a modest but clean studio in a supervised building, Amber came across a faded photograph. "May I?" she asked, picking up the image. Thomas nodded, pausing in his arrangement of toiletries on the small bathroom shelf. The photograph showed a younger Thomas in judicial robes, standing beside a teenage boy in a graduation cap and gown. Both were smiling broadly at the camera. "Who is this?" Amber asked. Thomas moved closer, studying the image with a soft expression. "Marcus Johnson, one of the first young men to complete the diversion program I created. He had been caught selling drugs at 16, looking at serious time. Instead, he went through our program, finished high school, and eventually became a social worker himself." Thomas's voice held quiet pride. "Last I heard, he was running youth programs in West Philadelphia." "To see." Amber studied the photograph, struck by the contrast between the confident judge in the image and the homeless man she had met in the rain. Yet looking at Thomas now, standing straighter, eyes clearer after proper medical care, she could see that same person emerging again. "You made a real difference," she said simply. Thomas returned the photograph to his small collection of belongings. "I tried, but the system remains deeply flawed. For every Marcus, there were 10 others we couldn't reach effectively." "Still," Amber insisted, "what you built mattered. It still matters." That evening, after leaving Thomas settled in his new temporary home, Amber found herself researching the juvenile diversion program he had created. Articles from legal journals described its innovative approach and impressive success rates. One piece included interviews with program graduates, now adults with stable lives who attributed their second chances to Judge Reeves's belief in their potential. As she read, a question began forming in Amber's mind. How had a man who had helped so many people ended up with no one to help him when he needed it most? A month after their initial breakfast meeting, Amber met Thomas at a community center in North Philadelphia, where he had begun volunteering 3 mornings a week. With Marlene's assistance, Thomas had secured more permanent housing in a subsidized apartment for seniors, and the stability had visibly improved his physical and mental health. "The volunteer coordinator discovered my background," Thomas explained, as he showed Amber around the center. "Now I'm helping people with basic legal questions 2 days a week. Nothing formal, just guidance on where to find resources." Amber observed how differently Thomas carried himself in this environment, shoulders straight, voice confident as he explained the center's programs. The homeless man from the alleyway was transforming back into Judge Reeves, though his experiences had clearly left their mark. "I have something to show you," Amber said when Thomas had finished his tour. She handed him a folder containing printouts of her research on his diversion program. Thomas flipped through the pages slowly, recognition and something like grief passing across his features. "I hadn't seen some of these articles in years," he murmured. "The program is still running," Amber pointed out. "Different name now, but the structure you created remains intact." Thomas nodded, closing the folder. "That's gratifying to hear." "I've been thinking," Amber continued carefully. "Have you considered reaching out to any of the people you helped? The graduates of your program?" Thomas's expression closed slightly. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not imposing to reconnect with people whose lives you changed," Amber countered. "From everything I've read, many of them would probably welcome the opportunity to thank you." Before Thomas could respond, they were interrupted by a staff member informing him that people were waiting for the legal advice session. As Thomas excused himself, Amber made a decision. She hadn't planned to proceed without his permission, but seeing his reluctance to reach out for help had strengthened her resolve. Later that day, Amber contacted Marcus Johnson, the young man from the photograph, now the director of a youth center in West Philadelphia. She explained her connection to Thomas, and without revealing all details of the judge's situation, asked if Marcus would be willing to meet. 3 days later, Amber accompanied Thomas to what he believed was a community meeting about senior services. Instead, they arrived at a small conference room where Marcus Johnson waited. Now in his 40s, Marcus still had the broad smile Amber had seen in the photograph, though he was now a substantial man with graying temples. Thomas stopped abruptly in the doorway, recognition and confusion crossing his face. "Marcus?" "Judge Reeves," Marcus replied, stepping forward to shake Thomas's hand. "It's been a long time." The initial awkwardness quickly dissolved as Marcus expressed his gratitude for the second chance Thomas had given him decades earlier. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself back then," he explained. "That made all the difference." As they talked, Marcus revealed that he had tried to contact Thomas after hearing about the investment fraud case that had been in the news years earlier, but by then, Thomas had already disappeared from his former life. "I wanted to help," Marcus said. "After all you did for me, for all of us." "All of us?" Thomas questioned. Marcus smiled. "Judge, did you think you could disappear, and none of the hundreds of kids you helped would notice? We've been looking for you." Marcus explained that an informal network of Reeves kids, graduates of the diversion program, had been attempting to locate the judge after hearing rumors about his financial troubles. Some had become lawyers, teachers, counselors, and business owners. Others had more modest accomplishments, but had stayed out of the criminal justice system. Itself a victory. "We're having a reunion next month," Marcus said. "Many of us get together annually to support the current program participants. We'd be honored if you would attend." Thomas sat in stunned silence, clearly overwhelmed by the revelation that his work had created not just individual success stories, but a community that remembered him. "I'm not sure what to say," he finally responded. "Say you'll come," Marcus urged, "and say you'll let us help, the way you helped us." After their meeting with Marcus, Thomas and Amber walked through Fairmount Park, the autumn leaves creating a tapestry of red and gold around them. Thomas was uncharacteristically quiet, processing the unexpected encounter. "I should be angry with you for arranging that without telling me," he finally said, though his tone held no reproach. "Are you?" Amber asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, I'm grateful and humbled." He paused by a bench overlooking the Schuylkill River. "I built my career on the belief that people deserve second chances, that a single mistake shouldn't define a life. Yet somehow, I couldn't apply that same principle to myself. It's always easier to help others than to accept help," Amber observed. "Indeed," Thomas agreed. "When I lost everything, I also lost my identity, or thought I did. Being homeless becomes all-consuming. You forget who you were because survival demands focus on the immediate: food, shelter, safety." "And now?" Amber prompted. Thomas watched a pair of joggers pass by before answering. "Now I'm remembering that a person is more than their circumstances." "You reminded me of that, Dr. Collins. Amber, when you saw me as someone worth helping." The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to Amber's eyes. In her work at the hospital, she rarely had the opportunity to follow patients' journeys beyond immediate medical crises. With Thomas, she had witnessed something profound. Not just a physical transformation, but a reclamation of dignity and purpose. "Will you go to the reunion?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it's time to reconnect with that part of my life." The community center gymnasium had been transformed with streamlined decorations, nothing extravagant, but thoughtfully arranged to create a welcoming atmosphere. Approximately 70 people had gathered for the reunion of Judge Reeves's diversion program graduates, spanning 3 decades of participants. Amber stood near the entrance, watching as Thomas entered the room. He wore a new suit, nothing expensive, but properly fitted, that Marlene had helped him purchase for the occasion. The transformation from the man she had met in the rain months earlier was remarkable. Marcus approached immediately, guiding Thomas through the crowd. People of various ages greeted the judge with respect and genuine affection. Some shared quick stories of how his intervention had changed their trajectories. Others simply thanked him and moved on. Thomas received each interaction with growing confidence, the mantle of his former role settling back onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a familiar weight. Midway through the evening, Marcus called for attention and invited Thomas to speak. Amber could see momentary panic cross the judge's face before he composed himself and moved to the front of the room. "I'm not prepared with formal remarks," Thomas began, his voice initially hesitant but gaining strength. "When I created this program 30 years ago, I had a simple belief that young people deserved the chance to learn from mistakes, rather than be defined by them." He paused, surveying the faces before him. Doctors, teachers, tradespeople, parents, all connected by the common thread of having once stood in his courtroom at a crossroads. "What I never anticipated was how much I would learn from all of you," he continued. "Each of you took the opportunity seriously, did the work, and built lives that prove second chances are worthy investment." Thomas then shared, with careful dignity, some of his own journey, the losses, mistakes, and hardships that had led to his homelessness. He spoke without self-pity, but with honesty about mental health, isolation, and the humbling experience of needing help after a lifetime of providing it to others. "I lost sight of what I had preached from the bench for years, that we all need community, that independence is a myth, and that accepting help requires as much courage as offering it." As Thomas concluded his remarks, the room erupted in applause. What followed was unexpected. Marcus announced the creation of the Reeves Second Chance Scholarship, funded by contributions from program graduates to support education for current participants. Additionally, several attendees who worked in legal services offered to help Thomas pursue restitution in the fraud case that had decimated his finances. Later, as the event wound down, Amber found Thomas sitting quietly in a corner, observing the room with visible emotion. "How are you feeling?" she asked, taking the seat beside him. "Overwhelmed," he admitted. "In the best possible way." He gestured toward the dispersing crowd. "I never expected this legacy." "You changed lives," Amber said simply. "That ripples outward in ways we can't always see." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "When you found me that rainy day, I had given up on the idea that my life still held purpose. I was simply existing." He met her gaze directly. "You changed that with a pair of socks and a coffee." Amber smiled, remembering their first encounter. "I had no idea who you were." "That's precisely what made it meaningful," Thomas replied. "You saw a person, not a position or a past." In the months that followed, Thomas's life continued its remarkable reconstruction. With legal assistance from program graduates now practicing law, he successfully challenged some of the fraudulent debts assigned to his name and secured a partial recovery of his pension. While not returning him to his former financial status, these developments provided stability and dignity. More significantly, Thomas found new purpose. He began formally volunteering with the current iteration of his diversion program, mentoring participants and training staff. His first-hand experience with homelessness brought valuable perspective to his work, allowing him to address practical barriers that his earlier judicial perspective had sometimes missed. Amber remained connected to Thomas, their friendship evolving beyond its initial caregiving dynamic into mutual respect and regular communication. Her experience with him influenced her medical practice, particularly how she approached homeless patients in the emergency room, seeing beyond immediate crises to the complex lives and potential dignity waiting to be restored. 1 year after their first meeting, Amber and Thomas returned to the same diner where they had shared breakfast with Marlene. Now it was a celebration. Thomas had recently been asked to serve on a city commission addressing homelessness, bringing his unique perspective as both a former judge and someone who had experienced life on the streets. "I've been thinking about that day in the rain," Thomas said as they finished their meal. "About how different my life would be if you had walked past like everyone else." "I almost did," Amber admitted. "It was the socks that made me stop, seeing your feet in those worn-out shoes in the cold." Thomas smiled. "Small things matter. A pair of socks, a kind word. We never know which small act will change everything." As they left the diner, stepping into bright spring sunshine that had replaced the previous year's rain, Amber reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with that simple encounter. What had started as a moment of compassion had evolved into a restoration of purpose and dignity that extended far beyond one man's life. Thomas adjusted the blue scarf he still wore, now a symbol rather than a necessity, and they walked together down the Philadelphia street, two people whose lives had become unexpectedly but permanently connected through an act of kindness that had revealed something profound. that every person, regardless of their circumstances, carries a story worth knowing and a future worth investing in.